Okay, my student government friends, tonight we're going to talk about the right to vote in America. So we're going to go through the history of who gets the right to vote, how they got the right to vote, and we're going to look a little bit about the different trends and who has the right to actually set state requirement or voting requirements in the United States. First, we're going to talk a couple vocabulary words so that you understand, or when you hear these words in the future, you know exactly what they mean. The framers of the Constitution actually left suffrage, or the power of suffrage, defining the right to vote, to each of the states. So the states have this power, not the federal government. So suffrage is actually the right to vote. Another term to mean the right to vote is the word franchise. And last but not least, the electorate, which is the potential voting population. So I am part of the electorate. Some of you may be 18. If you're 18, you are now part of the electorate. Those of you who are 17 or 16 will be part of the electorate when you turn 18. The flags here at the bottom represent the gradual addition of states or the rights to vote over the years. The first flag is 1777, the beginning of our great nation. The middle flag is roughly 1820, where more states and more people have joined the nation and have gained the right to vote. The last flag is 1865. There are 36 stars on that flag, meaning that there are 36 states in the United States that technically have given people the right to vote. And if you know your history, 1865 is when the Civil War ended, and the 15th Amendment is being close to being passed, meaning African American males should be able to have the right to vote very soon afterwards. So, the expansion of the electorate. When our great nation began in 1789 with the Constitution, the only people that could vote in the United States were white male property owners. At that time in the United States, 1 in 15 white adult males could actually vote. That is through all 13 states that are part of the Union. So 1 in 15 people could actually vote because they owned property. Now, let's jump ahead to 2013. There's 216 million people, at least 18 years old, in the United States today that have the right to vote. So those numbers have grown exponentially. They have come as a direct result of state laws and also a extremely bitter and sometimes violent struggle, especially during the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. So the right to vote is a ongoing struggle for many people in the United States from the time that the Constitution is written through even today. Okay. American history has been marked by two long-term trends. The first of those two long-term trends is the gradual elimination of restrictions on the right to vote. Now, I know we talk a lot about the restriction on race, black versus white, can you vote, can you not vote, on the issue of sex. Men can vote, women can't vote. Eventually, women get the right to vote. There have been other restrictions placed on people that have gradually been lifted throughout history, or since the Constitution was written in 1789, one of those being religious beliefs. Actually, during the colonial days, if you were of a particular religion, you had to take a test on you had to take a religious test in order to vote. So if you remember from 8th grade history, when you talk about the colonial history here in the United States, religion was a huge part of what ruled everybody's lives, especially when they first came to the New World. We just talked about property ownership. You had to be white and male and own property. Tax payment. You had to pay a tax to vote for a federal office. Race. African American males will eventually gain the right to vote, as will women. And sex. Male or female women will gain the right to vote as well. So there is no restrictions based on race or sex any longer. The second long-term trend that we have seen here in the United States is that the state's power over who has the right to vote has gradually been assumed by the federal government. Due to the history behind voting here in the United States, the federal government has taken steps to ensure that people have the rights to vote. Okay, there are 5 stages to extending suffrage here in the United States. We're going to start with the earliest, which would have been the colonial days in the 1800s. You had to take a religious test to vote. This disappears in 1810, but religious qualifications were part of your restrictions on voting back in the colonial days. One by one, states began to eliminate property ownership and tax payment qualifications. By 1850, almost all white male adults could vote in every state, which is roughly right before the time that the Civil War starts. So we're starting to release some restrictions on voting, but there are still a lot of people who cannot vote in the United States. After the Civil War, so post-1865, the 15th Amendment will be put into place in the United States where you cannot be denied the right to vote based on race or color. We all know that that's not true, and African American males African Americans will be denied the right to vote at least for another century. This amendment was supposed to protect citizens, but for another century they were systematically prevented from voting through the grandfather clause and poll taxes and literacy tests. So African Americans have struggled for the right to vote for nearly a century until they gained full voting rights. 1920, if you're familiar with your American history, this is the passage of the 19th Amendment where you cannot deny votes based on sex. The great state of Wyoming actually gave women the right to vote in 1869, so 4 short years after the Civil War ended. And by 1920, actually half the United States had followed suit. So the federal government is just taking steps to ensure that everybody, all women in all states, could have the right to vote. The 1960s, as we all know, was a turbulent time here in the United States for voting rights and equal rights for African Americans. Federal legislature and court decisions actually focused on securing African Americans the full role in the electoral process in all states throughout the United States through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. After that passage was taken care of, racial equality finally became fact in polling booths throughout our country. The 23rd Amendment was also added. This allows voters in the District of Columbia to be able to vote for federal offices. And the passage of the 24th Amendment eliminates poll taxes during the 1960s. And last in 1971, the 26th Amendment will come about, and that's a minimum voting age for 18-year-olds, or minimum voting age will be 18. This comes about because of the Vietnam War. They argued that if you are 18 and old enough to go fight and die for your country, you should be old enough to be able to vote for your country. So that is how the passage of the 26th Amendment came about here in the United States. Okay, so the Constitution did not give the federal government the power to set suffrage qualifications. Those rights were specifically reserved for the states, but they have actually, over time, put 5 restrictions on state powers in regards to voting due to all of the turbulent and trying times that we have gone through. States must allow voters to vote in all elections within the state. So if you are voting for any type of position, you have to be allowed to vote. No state can deprive any person of the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That is the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. No state can be denied a person the right to vote based on sex. This is the 19th Amendment of our Constitution. Number 4, no state can require any type of tax in the election of any federal office holder. So you cannot tax the election if you are voting for a federal office such as the President or Vice President of the United States. And lastly, no state can deny anyone 18 or over the right to vote. So those are the 5 restrictions that the states have to follow based on the Constitution and the changes that we have made. Beyond these 5 restrictions, remember, no state can violate any other provision in the Constitution in setting of suffrage qualifications. So they cannot violate that any other place for voting. We're going to look at one Supreme Court case. This is Hill versus Stone. It happened in 1975. The Texas Constitution read that only persons who owned taxable property could vote in city bond elections. The Supreme Court ended up stepping in, and their ruling was that it was an unreasonable classification, and it was in violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, meaning that you could vote for anyone and they could not place any restrictions on voters based on taxing or taxable property due to the Constitution. That is the end of our PowerPoint. Remember, I need you to go back to ClassJump.com. I need you to leave a question on the message board titled "The Right to Vote." We'll use that to answer it, or use it to focus a discussion in class tomorrow. This will be a homework grade. I will be checking it before the start of class. Make sure you have taken your notes, or rewatch the video if you need to, and have a great evening.